Welcome to Under the Microscope. I am your host, Jenny Germano. Thanks everyone for joining me today. I am excited for this next episode. Before I jump in, I just want to give a little bit about my background. I got my start working in the cannabis industry in 2009, running and operating vertically integrated facilities here in Denver, Colorado. And then 2015, I founded my company, ICS Consulting, and I've been helping operators nationally navigate the regulatory landscape across the country. So today's topic, we are going to be talking about efficient cash management for cannabis operators. So let's everyone give a warm welcome to my next guest, Jennifer Makris of Cannabis Cash Consultants. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks for having me. So
I'm
excited.
happy to have you here today. I think you're going to provide some valuable information to listeners. Before we jump in, why don't you go ahead and just share a little bit about your background when you came to the cannabis industry?
I love my cannabis journey and my story. It really parallels how I grew up. When I grew up in the transportation and logistics arena, my parents owned and operated a travel agency, which, Jenny, to this day, it's still in business, which
Wow.
in today's era, 2025, with Expedia and all the things like the brick and mortar travel agency is still in business. And so I was always responsible for moving people and things from point A to point B. So parlay that into after graduation, I've always worked for Fortune 500 companies, which really I think was the foundation for my success as I went out on my own as a consultant. And so I went from Cintas, right? So dirty pants and dirty kitchen towels, right? To trucks, guns, and cash when I worked for Brinks. So way sexier of an industry, right? Trucks, guns, and cash, sign me up. But in my experience with Brinks, I was managing state and local financial institutions, which in Florida, when Florida legalized, they were the first ones that were ready to bank cannabis. And so those financial institutions that I was working with, they wanted to move the cannabis cash. And no is not an how, even if it's not with that armored transportation provider that I was working for. And so here in 2017, 2018, I organically grew this network of cannabis friendly financial institutions, which in Colorado in the beginning, super hard to come by. And
Oh,
still to this
yeah.
day, challenging, but a little bit more accessible and available than it was then. And then, in addition to the cannabis friendly financial institutions, then the cannabis friendly cash and transit solution. So, regional operators that would move the cannabis cash. I or grew those two networks organically. And then, once that cash was on site, how were the staff and the managers preparing and handling that cash? How were they receiving change orders or deposit preparations to go outbound back to the bank and the touch points of the cash? Because I always tell people and my customers, next to the product and the people, the cash is the most expensive and riskiest thing in the business. So getting to educate operators on, to your point earlier, what they
Yeah.
don't know or what they think they know about the cash handling process has been so profound. And just making a difference in that little arena, that slight niche that I have carved out for myself has been super exciting. And that is really what paved my way incidentally into the industry. I saw a need. I always knew logistics and moving things, like I said, from point A to point B, whether it's people or cash now, was part of my wheelhouse. And to find something so specialized that was a need for the industry is what paved the way for that back in 2017. And so I went to market with it. And here I am this many years later. I've been affectionately referred to as the cannabis cash queen, Jenny. Not a title I would give myself. In fact, it was after a podcast that I did, and this Southern lawyer from Mississippi said, "Girl, you're just like a cannabis cash queen." And in that moment, like time stopped, the bells went off. I was like, oh my gosh, that's my moniker. That's who I am. And I could have told you everything that I just shared with you, but you're never going to forget cannabis cash queen.
That's true. I love that.
I'm not mad at
And
it.
we could have a tiara made out of money.
Yes, let's do that for our next event that we're at together. Let's make that
We'll make
happen.
it a money tiara. I'm going to go ahead and dive in, and I'm going to start with why cash still
Mm,
rules.
mm.
And so, why does cash remain so dominant in cannabis retail today?
I think there are two answers to that question. In the beginning, I would say cash so dominant and still remains dominant, and cash will always be king to her queen in the industry, and there'll always be cash in tender and as a use. But I really think it's twofold. One, because of the unbanked society, the unbanked demographic that transact in cash. the other ones that don't want to have their digital footprint, right? Even though you have to show a license to go in and purchase product, that digital transaction, I'll tell you, that's why I resisted getting my license here in Florida, because working for an institution such as Brinks, I was afraid for them to know that I was purchasing medical cannabis, right? And so I was always transacting in cash, and still to this day, transacting cash. So I think it's, again, for the unbanked demographic, there's also some tax advantages, which we'll get into later, about
Mhm.
transacting solely in cash. But on the flip side to that, Jenny, it is risky to transact in cash, right? It's more cumbersome. There's more of a burden to employees and safety concerns when you're utilizing so much cash in circulation at a location such as a dispensary and other cash intensive industries such as gaming, adult entertainment establishments, etc. But I think cash will always be in circulation in our generation. When rescheduling occurs, notice I said when, not if, when it occurs, there'll be an impact to cash in use, because that will open up the digital components, the digital availability to transact with a digital payment, a digital wallet, credit cards. But I still think we will always see a robust use of cash in this industry.
Yeah, I agree. What kind of challenges do you think still exist today for operators, I guess, around banking?
So let me just go back to banking in a moment. The other thing I wanted to say about cash in circulation, and this really does tie into banking as well, because we think about cash in the retail environment,
Yeah.
but think about cash in the cultivation space. So I had a customer in rural New York. They were 4 hours away from their financial institution. A cash in transit or an armored provider wouldn't go out that far to where they were located. So they would have to, during harvest, right? So during that 2 times a year when they would sell to their providers, their suppliers, or I guess their purchasers, right? They're bringing in millions of dollars in cash. So that's a safety concern. But also, how much time is it taking for you to prepare that cash to drive it to the bank? And what kind of security risk is it that you're putting those millions of dollars in cash in your trunk and now driving 4 hours to the bank? So that restriction from a banking perspective and a logistics perspective really does create a lot of risk as it relates to cash. And again, in a segment of our ecosystem that we don't think about, the cultivation side, that are paying their vendors in cash and they're getting cash in for their harvest. That has been something very unique that I've seen outside of just the retail segment of our industry. To your question about banking, I think, to my point a moment ago, there is a lot more access to banking for operators than there was 10, 13 years ago when it legalized in California and Colorado. And I really do give a lot of credit to those financial institutions that were willing to make the risk from the jump, right? The ones that were willing to get mud on their face, or I was trying to use an industry reference term, keep on their face, and go through those hardships to get banking and safe banking, not to be confused with safe banking that's trying to be done at the government level, banking for those operators, because we need to get that cash off the street. So more and more financial institutions are coming to play in this space. They're willing to take the risk, and they understand that there's not a bunch of money to be made, but as soon as like lending opens up for banking, these loans, these debt consolidations that you're reading more and more about, banking is a pivotal role in our industry, and access to financial institutions willing to bank them. To that point, though, and you and I were at a conference together, we heard from a voice of an operator in New Mexico, and she shared her hardships as a
Yeah.
micro business and the fees, the exorbitant amount of fees that they're having to pay. And I am starting to see that level off, that they're not being raked over the coals with fees, but it is still more than the average business in a mainstream industry, that they're paying above what those fees would be as compared to your Joe's Mechanics down the street or Betty's Diner. But at least there are more options than there was, which is encouraging.
Yeah. In the early days, the fees were really astronomical. And
So
I did a lot of lobbying in DC in the early days with some lobby groups. And there would be a lot of operators from California, Oregon, and Washington State. And they were telling me these horror stories of what they were being charged for bank accounts. We're probably talking 2015,
mhm,
2016. And some of them were being charged per license just to have a bank account. Could have been anywhere from five to $10,000 a month,
thousands. Yep.
thousands and thousands of dollars. We have so many credit unions, bless the credit unions, that decided to come in. Probably the most credit unions I've ever seen are now involved in the cannabis industry, and more are coming online. And grateful for them because it has lowered those fees. And operators are already paying enough fees, right? They're paying their licensing fees, which can be anywhere from 5,000 to $30,000 for kind of the medium to small sized operators. They're having to pay their seat to sale tracking fees. all these different fees, all their tech stack fees, and it can really add up for a small operator. I know MSOs, it's a different ballpark for MSOs because their funding and capital is different than, let's say, a mom and pop who they're strictly self-funded. And thanks a lot for bringing up the cultivation piece. I think that's also really important. I know a lot of this conversation might be geared towards retail, but if you ever want to jump in and talk about a cultivator or manufacturer, obviously they're selling too. They're just not direct to consumer. They're more on the wholesale side and duffel bags of cash in someone's
Huh.
trunk in New York State. I'm not
Yeah.
surprised because when I
No.
was running these facilities, we had duffel bags of cash. A dispensary I was running was making something like $50,000 a day, and it was duffel bags of cash. Nobody would pick it up. We were like walking out of the store with $50,000 in duffel bags of cash in 2014. It was nuts.
The Wild West days. And Jenny, I'll be sitting with my customers, and your life and your safety is important to me. So if we are not able to get a secure method of transportation that's insured, the chain of custody, when it leaves your property, now it's in the custody of that armored transportation provider. That insurability now falls on the CIT provider. And then once it gets to the bank, like it's a fluid process. But if you are a mom and pop, to your point, or you are in a rural part of the state where you don't have access to that, your life is important to me and your safety is important to me. And so please, Mr. or Miss Manager or owner, please do not be putting that duffel bag in your vehicle at 3 p.m. every day and drive to the same location, because those bad guys are watching you,
Oh,
right? And we
yeah.
don't, and goodness forbid you get in a vehicle accident or there is some sort of that occurs. Who is at fault? Who is liable? And who's protecting that cash, let alone the employee involved in all that? Your car insurance, your corporate insurance, that it's not covering that cannabis cash. So those are other things from an insurability and your policies, like looking at those coverages to make sure what is protected and what's not. So that is a really important piece that I'm super passionate about, because again, I'll say it a couple times on this conversation, the people and the product, next to the people and the product, the cash is the most expensive and riskiest thing in that business.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good information. And it is a risk. And I think in today's age, 2025, it's so easy to case people because someone walking around with a cell phone, taking pictures, acting like they're recording a video is so normal that people don't even pay attention anymore. Where maybe 20 years ago, that would have been, that's suspicious. What's that
Mm-hmm.
person doing? And now I think it's easy for criminals to surveil these operators. And if you're doing the same thing at the same time every day, I think it ends up being pretty easy to figure out. So I think safety is vital and important. And people really need to make smart decisions working with somebody like you or making sure working with their credit union and having that armored truck service. I understand it's not really available for
Mm-hmm.
everyone. I would not want to be traveling with that much cash on
No,
me.
no.
And product too. Also the pounds of product and then all the cash from getting the money for that product.
Exactly. I will say it's different by market, right? If you're a vertically
Yeah,
integrated market or horizontal. The other thing
true.
is, to your point about MSOs versus mom and pops, right? So the leverage there in terms of banking power or those other CIT cash and transit providers that want their business, they're going to be afforded that solution or that service first, especially before a rural mom and pop out in the middle of Western Washington state, right? Or in Wyoming. So there's
In
definitely
New
New
Mexico, you can get
Mexico.
into the middle
Yes.
of nowhere land in New Mexico.
Yeah. And shout out to the credit unions, Jenny. You made a great point. Shout out to them for the ones that are helping to level set the banking side of things. And I really do think it is a testament to the culture and their appreciation for members, right? They're not customers, they are members, and how they treat their members. So I do say that a big fan of how the credit union is coming in as a player. And they were really one of the first to want to bank
They
cannabis,
were.
those in the state banks back in the day. They're helping keeping things within the proper rails, let's just say.
Yeah, I have so many crazy stories from the early days where, like, we would tell trimmers they couldn't go into the bank covered in trim or smelling like cannabis at all. They couldn't just take their check after trimming all day, and they had to go in clean and showered, or it would risk the payroll getting shut down. Because back in the days, you'd be banking at, like, Wells Fargo or Chase or one of these really big banks. Nobody really had nowhere to go in the early days, and then just the stories of people having their bank account shut down 7, 10 times, even non-plant touching companies having their bank account shut down, or things like QuickBooks shut down, or credit cards
Mhm.
with Visa or MasterCard. There's just so many different stories out there.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
my other thing is, what are some of the biggest pain points? I know we're talked a little bit about some of them, but what are some of the biggest pain points that you see, whether it's theft or inefficiency or also compliance pressure?
See all of the above. Yes. So that's actually what kind of keeps me up at night, to be honest with you, is how are we putting protocols in place for the safety of employees, but also reducing the risk and temptations for theft? So,
Correct.
so we want to deploy different types of equipment, different technologies to automate that cash touching process. So, if you are a larger operation and you have the budget for something more robust, like a teller cash recycler, a teller cash recycler would be in the back of the house where you would prepare tills. You can recycle your like your
Yeah.
larger denominations to where you can recycle your smaller denominations, excuse me, to outfit your drawers and your tills for every day, and then send those larger denominations to the bank. And that eliminates multiple touch points where your employees are physically touching and counting out the cash. So I love a nice robust solution like that. I advise my customers, if I can show you an ROI, if you're going to make an investment in a piece of equipment that is north of $20,000, which some of those devices are, if I can show you that with X amount of labor savings per week or per month, I can show you that device will pay for itself in, let's say, under 18 months, depending on the various factors that we just shared. Now, for a mid tier operator or even a mom and pop, the price of entry is at minimum a tabletop counter, right? You should have that for rapid verification of votes,
100%.
a quick checkpoint, validation of your deposit. That should be the minimum. But cannabis cash, like stripper cash, is dirty, right? You have glitter with the other industry, and you've got like residue and odors from, I guess, both. But from the cannabis cash, right? So those devices can get dirty easily. So you want to make sure that there's also proper care of those devices. That's another conversation for another day. Tabletop counters at minimum. The other end of the spectrum is the teller cash recycler. And in between, we've got other right size, right fit devices for that operator, such as a smart safe. We talked about access to cash and access to getting that cash to the bank. If you deploy something called a smart safe, we often provide solutions such as provisional credit. And what that means is the moment that cash hits the device, nobody else can get it out except for your cash and transit provider. It is like a reverse ATM. Cash can only go in. And then at the end of the night, similar to your credit cards machine in a traditional industry, it will batch out, right? So it will send a file to your bank that tells you the amount of cash that's in that device. And now it's accessible for you for operational expenses the very next day, even though the actual tangible physical cash has not left the four walls of your building.
That's
So I
wild.
love that solution. I think it's a great solution for better cash position, especially people that need access to that operating cash for payroll or for vendors or bills. Like, so I think that's a wonderful, and that really does lean on if your financial institution and your carrier can provide that sort of solution. So I gave you the full spectrum, and there's a
Yeah.
couple things in between, counters of cash and things like that. But deploying those types of devices help reduce the risk of theft, as well as secure standard operating procedures that close the loop on what I affectionately refer to as the cannabis cash ecosystem. You want to make sure all of those touch points are fluid and secured. So theft was the first one. B was compliant practices, or was that
Inefficiency.
inefficiency? How many times? Listen, I may have my master's, but math is not my forte. And you give me a stack of cash, and you bet your bottom dollar that I'm recounting that stack of cash at least four times
Yeah.
because I'm second guessing myself. Or maybe they were ATM fit currency. So now they're sticking together. And now cash is dirty and it's getting all over my hands. So recounting cash and dual control is a huge inefficiency that I see operators challenged with. And again, it may be what they don't know, or they don't have solid SOPs in place for the to streamline the efficient touch
It's
points in the
true.
cash process. 100%. And then the compliance, right? So you want to have compliant operating procedures around your cash handling. So how often does cash need to be removed from your dispensary? Oftentimes, the bank will dictate how frequently they need those deposits, especially when I'm referring to that smart, safe solution. they could go a week, sometimes 2 weeks without removing that cash, but you still have credit for that cash in your bank account. So that compliant practice of how often the cash needs to be removed, but also how frequently are you requesting money inbound for your tills, for change orders to actually do daily transactions and exchanges with your customers from the bud tenders. You want to make sure that you've got a process in place that allows you to, again, this would be a compliant practice, allows you to reuse internally the cash you have. So that's a discipline of reutilizing the cash you have by, again, reutilizing the smaller denominations and preparing for deposit those larger denominations. So that discipline really helps keep your banking fees down, keeps your risk of theft down, helps compliant practices be efficient and streamlined. So all three of those, two of those, and C, all of the above really speaks to reducing the risk and the temptation of theft. Because if you have a gap, they're going to find that gap.
It's
And then how
true.
are you providing compliant practices with your cash in alignment with what your bank and even sometimes what the state requires from that practice? And then again, making sure all of those are tied up in a nice little green bow and trained and practiced by your staff.
On one of my episodes, almost 10 to 15 episodes ago, we talked about internal theft and how 70 to 80% in the cannabis industry is internal theft, whether or it's cash or product or how that divides up. But because it's an inside job. And I think people see what you're doing with cash. For example, I go swim laps every evening at my gym. Lately, I've been noticing that's interesting. I leave my gym and I see them pulling the drawer and they're counting it right out in front of everyone. And I'm sitting there going, that is shocking. Because I come from the cannabis industry where you cannot be counting your drawer as people are coming in and out of your dispensary. And I think where are their processes? And this is a recreational
Mhm.
center and it's run by the city. And I thought that was interesting how they count their cash.
We are highly elevated. Yes, we are. But we are honed into that. It is definitely something, it's a heightened sense of awareness around that for us with our lens. But to your point, I was just thinking back to when I was like 16 and 17 in my high school job, and I was counting cash at the front counter. And I'm thinking to myself, did I have somebody with me? Did I have dual control? Were customers still coming in and out of that business? And again, we have a heightened sense of awareness now. I've had all this cash management exposure my entire life, but while it might have only been a couple $100 in cash and sing for a couple $100 in cash at the gym, you never know what point of disparity are people in that they would be willing to do that. And you brought up another good point, like internal jobs, internal theft. And you read about these burglaries happening in California. And I read an article, and forgive me, I cannot remember the statistic because you asked me or you mentioned, not sure which percentage is
Yeah.
product versus cash. I just read something the other day about it, and obviously it did not resonate with what that stat was, but that sometimes the cash is more secured than the product is. And so they're coming for product as opposed to the cash, especially if you have a bolted device, et cetera, et cetera. But that there's also the threats of external intrusions, right? External theft from the outside bad guys too. I remember horror stories from my Brinks days that this drunkard with a pickup truck in Texas went and rushed at a vestibule ATM, wrapped a chain around the ATM and hauled it out of the vestibule, right? Only you also have three other points of entry into an ATM. So good luck getting into that third point of entry, that cassette, because it's definitely, I'm sure there's a way, especially if you can haul out a ATM with a truck. But it's interesting the lengths people will go to and at what is going on in their world that there's such disparity that those are the actions that they
Yeah.
need to take.
Yeah. So next, I wanted to tackle tactical
Mm.
strategies and best practices, and then how dispensary operators balance staff with strong security in areas like storage and or cash drops. I know we probably covered a little bit of this.
Yeah. Yeah, we did. So from a tactical approach, I just mentioned a bit ago is deploying those devices, right? Devices that complement the cash handling process that make it a more streamlined and less touch points, which reduce the amount of exposure points, risk points in that cash process. So from a tactical approach, I would definitely recommend some sort of secure logistics of the cash as opposed to putting it in our trunk, and also deploying technologies or pieces of hardware to streamline that approach. From a staff training and like staffing, that obviously comes into, I love being on site with a dispensary, whether they're already in operation for years or they're a brand new operator. There's power in being on site with
It
those
is.
folks.
Yeah.
the trainer, as in our world, the turnover is exponential. Whether you're going from this dispensary to the next dispensary, you're a young stoner, you're a bud, like whatever, right? But the longevity and tenure of a dispensary employee is not long. So if you can put together a training module, training program that is easily duplicatable and replicatable, that is the first step of defense. And then being on site to train those folks, and first shift, right? They're there at 7 a.m. The doors open at 9. I'm bringing in donuts. We're talking about till preparation, whether we're counting or using a device. And then we're going through those. And so watching them actually do the activity helps it cement that everyday practice of. And so being on site has so much power in it. And I really
It
enjoy that.
does.
And when we can't be there, then obviously we go to virtual options such as this. But what I was going to say about the staffing, dual control is always important, right? Whether that's dual control and utilizing the equipment in the back of the house, obviously surveillance is everywhere in these types of environments, but having staffing towards a dual control process, shift change, also from a tactical approach. If you have a bud tender that's going on break and you have somebody else taking over that drawer, what does that process look like? Who's accountable if a $20 bill is missing or a $50 bill is missing? And it was during that shift break, right? Are we proper procedures with relation to the POS? Proper relation to, like, is there a mid-till sweep that's done? Meaning we're sweeping the drawers after they get to a certain amount, or somebody's going on break. Who's responsible for the contents and the integrity of that drawer during those particular situations? Is really important to speak to, especially when it comes to staffing. And then obviously, you want to believe that everybody in your building is trustworthy and they're doing the right thing. But when your back is turned, what's happening behind, or when you're not there or something, what's happening? And so you just want to make sure that you are closing as many loops as possible and you're putting in the procedures to where those things can run smoothly from both a tactical perspective, from an efficiency perspective, and that your staff is bought into those processes. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, and I would say, like, I am not a fan of shared tills at all, and I always tell my clients to order double the tills. If you have 3 POS stations, then you should have 6 tills, and
Yep.
that when one shift's leaving, they pull out their till, and then you can slip in the next till, and that you should
100%.
not be sharing POS stations so you can have accountability with the cashier or the person ringing in sales. You start sharing, and then people aren't logging in and out of their POS system, or they're ringing in someone under someone else's password because they're sharing the computer. It just gets so messy and so sloppy. It's really hard to track accountability with cash and tills and who did what or who made what mistake. And so it's really important to have those clean processes in place. And as somebody who ran dispensaries, I'll just say now, don't share your tills. Just have the double amount of tills, and you can
Yep.
keep them in your vault or your safe, and that way every shift has their own till, and they can be responsible for that till. And if somebody has a break, they just take their till with them, and they
Yep.
take it with them, and they log into the POS, and that way that till is always with them. It doesn't matter what computer you're on. The POS is gonna track the history of
Yep.
the sales, and all that history is attached to that user, the bud tender or the manager, whoever's ringing in the sales and bud tending.
So the duplicate tills is the path of least resistance, and it doesn't take a bunch of extra time. You are preventing work on the back end. And part of the last question you asked me was about like vaulting and storage of cash. And I love speaking to that because, again, whether you're already in operation and we're working with an existing framework, or I love being part of the conversation when we're still at the blueprint phase, right? We're still designing their vault and their cash room and their displays, because it can help map out how much do we need for processing cash? How much space do we need? Are we going to deploy a teller cash recycler that takes a little bit more real estate than just a tabletop counter, right? And do we want that in the room where the product is? Does your state allow it to
Yeah.
be commingled? So based on the state and where we're operating, we have some restrictions and guidelines to follow. But I love being part of that process, a nice flow of whether it's inventory management or cash management, inventory to cash. It's really cool to be able to create a little home for that. It's secure, it's back in the house. And they're not doing it in the front of the house, which gosh forbid that anybody's doing that in our space. I haven't seen that happen, but that's not to say it's not happening.
Hard to tell, I mean, with the thousands of dispensaries across
Oh,
the United States.
I guess hopefully optimistic that's not occurring, but yeah,
Sometimes
people.
sometimes at the end of the day, there's not context, And a lot of times I meet people who have never run a business ever. They were an employee their whole life and they just started their little mom and pop shop. And I think sometimes people are missing the context or the skills. And so that's why I think people should do the research. They should listen to podcasts and do webinars and go to networking event and just really try to build a community where you can get that information, especially if you're very green coming into this
Mhm.
industry.
I would just love to speak to that point real quick because what you just said is so important. And I will say that is how I built my brand in the industry is by going to those networking events, going to those conferences, immersing myself in the conversation to learn a different portion of the business that I wasn't as comfortable with. Yes, I had my lane carved out, but talking with operators, talking with banks outside of just my immediate area of Florida, because now at least I have the opportunity to go nationwide. But being open to learning is the biggest, I guess, advantage that you could be in service to yourself and to learning is to immerse yourself with others, take off those blinders, what you don't know, and immerse yourself with those reading and listening and putting yourself where those cannabis related conversations are being had so that you could just be a better business owner, better partner, better provider, better consultant, better banker, whatever it is. I think it's such an integral part of how we operate in this space. And people that come in from other industries or never owning a business before really disrupt the community and the culture that we have built in our industry, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's something to be said to getting national exposure. And I don't mean that in the sense of having your brand all over the United States. I'm a small operator running out of just one state, a single state operator. Going to another state or going to conferences in other states or going to a conference in your own state and getting those connections with people from other states, it actually makes your bubble bigger. I find a lot of
Mm,
people who never leave the state of Colorado, never been to a conference, don't really go networking. You're in this tiny little bubble and you don't realize that what you're going through, that everyone's going through in the industry,
mm,
and you get into this place like, "This is so hard, this is so challenging. Why is this happening to me?" Or you think that you're messing up somehow, you're making all these mistakes, and there's constant curveballs, and that's why it's so important to get out there and connect with other people and talk to other operators in different states or just go out to these shows, or if you can't, listen to a podcast, listen to a
mhm,
webinar. Find ways to expand that circle of information to more and really listen to what's going on across the country. Listen to what's going on not only in Colorado or California or Washington. Pay attention to what's going on in Minnesota or Michigan
oh,
or New
yeah.
Jersey, New York. And you'll see this thread, this common thread where, okay, that happened in Colorado and now I'm seeing it happening in New Jersey and New York. And we're going to see it here soon in Minnesota, and then we come back to Colorado, they're gonna start going into these dispensaries now in Colorado. They're gonna start randomly pulling all these things off the shelf and sending it to a state testing facility,
Wow.
and we're gonna see an uptick in violations, warnings, as well as recalls, and it's just a reminder when you think Colorado's getting sleepy, they always find a way to come back and say, "Hey, now OSHA's in Colorado for the next 5 years, and they're going into all these facilities, and now
Right.
they're gonna start pulling products off of all these dispensary shelves." Other states are watching, they're saying, "Hey, look what's going on in Colorado, maybe we should
Mhm.
start doing it." So it's just a good example to really keep your finger on the pulse and pay attention to what's going on in the industry as a whole, I think would help you as a business person and operator.
Amen, sister. Amen. And like you said, whatever happened in one state is happening in another one. They've all gone through those hardships. So you can learn conversely of what's happening. And I always, from a legislative and regulatory perspective, when new states roll out or they're making enhancements, look what the states have done. Look what the states have done not so well, and
Sure.
maybe take that into consideration as you're writing out your program or you're setting up your program, or in Florida, we're making another effort for adult use. And what happened that it didn't, all the things. So I think that to your point, don't let Colorado get sleepy on you because things are happening in those more
Yeah.
mature markets, right? And even operators and business owners in those more mature markets, see what's going on and how you can help our East Coast states that are coming online because there's so much value there. Not to use Minnesota as a reference, but there's so much tribal knowledge from these operators that have been doing it from the jump, right? 2009 in California, 2013 in Colorado. There's so much information that can be shared that will just help the whole industry streamline, or that's wishful thinking, right? but help the conversation move forward across our
Yeah.
industry. So off that soapbox, on to the next question.
I had a question about training. Like, what is the biggest training gap that you see in employees when it comes to handling cash?
Biggest training gap. I would say the redundancy, right? The redundancy in the example I gave earlier is the recounting of tills or the recounting of till prep or how you manage variances at the end of shift, right? Notating that or like fat fingering something in your POS and
Oh,
how do you go
yeah.
back and rectify that? I feel bad for the controllers of those institutions that have to go back like with a fine tooth comb and
Oh,
like find
yeah.
where that discrepancy is, right? And it's all because they're quick and they're not taking their time and you want to get on to the next customer, so that fat fingering and then again the variances, so how they handle variances is a gap in trainings. I would say, is there something you could do to rectify or resolve that variance before it's reported out for that end of day? And then it'd be great if the systems could talk to each other. Now this is a pie in the sky wish for Jen. Like if the systems could talk to each other, like if my teller cash recycler could be integrated in some capacity to the POS. And now there are more solutions that are coming online to where that is coming, but historically that has not been the case. So now you've got,
Interesting.
which I always like to look at the glass half full. Okay. If there is lemons, I'm going to make some lemonade. So back in the day, my customers would have to use multiple reports, right? You're pulling from your POS report, you're pulling from your safe report, and then you're pulling from your recycling reports and your dashboards, like your banking. But what I used to say, and I still do to some effect, is now you have various reports to verify the data, right? And if they all match, then now you 3 checks, we're good to go. So there's a way to glass half full, use those various reportings to make sure the data is accurate. My wish is that all of those systems could talk to each other and verify the information as accurate, or if there is some sort of variance or discrepancy, it's alerted on the front end, like real time, as opposed to more time that's spent in the back of the house preparing your end of day reports.
Yeah.
So that's a gap. There are companies that I've been involved in conversations working towards having all of those systems come together and communicate. Because there's nothing worse, like even with like metric or your PO, like there's nothing worse than having all these systems and these platforms and these data softwares that don't talk to each other. And now you're creating
Integration. Yeah.
redundancies and inefficiencies, et cetera. So that's a wish of mine. I think more and more people are advocating for that, deploying solutions to where they can talk to each other and integrate. But that is definitely a training gap that I see in that process.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I would think too, POS companies need to be educated on this as well. I'm not a coder. I don't know how to create a code and do API integration, but I do know it exists. And it seems like every POS company has API integration with Metric. And these ERPs have integration with QuickBooks and all these different things. Why couldn't this be an easy solution for POS companies to get into where we're at 2025 and have the solution? So that's a pretty interesting conversation. I think
I feel
people
like
probably need start having with some of these. And maybe you start with a big POS company and then everyone will follow.
I think it comes to a time and capacity challenge too. Rest assured, these conversations are being had, right? So I'm not saying they're not. We've come a long way since I began in the space, even when you began in the space. So we have come a long way because the voice of the operators are being heard. But from a capacity and engineering component, like you and I, we know that there's an API. We know that there's that functionality, but like how that works and the time, the coding and the engineering, like all of that, that's something that I know that I don't know. And so
I don't know.
and I don't want to either, actually. I don't want to know at all. However, I need to be able to speak to that and say, this is what my customer needs. And so it's a testing that, it's going to beta, it's the time, the money, the resources. So I will say more and more people are having these conversations and these POS systems are listening. But I feel like a POS conversation week, that's a whole other podcast, a whole show on its own. We could definitely go down that rabbit
It
hole.
is.
But also when a customer changes POS systems, like that's another
Oh,
training
yeah.
component too, right? That's like when a bank changes their core, they do a core conversion. So that is time, that is shutting down one program and transferring customer data. Like it is a hardship for sure. And so when a customer changes POS, that's like changing banking. It's the last thing you want to do. And it's so cumbersome and there's so many moving parts. And that's the last thing people want to do. But as you see, more and more people are switching these POS systems a little bit more frequently than they probably want
Yeah.
to.
It's
So,
true. They change them a lot. It's honestly, I think it's probably one of the toughest decisions for a
mm,
dispensary. And I think they sit there in agonizing pain for years
yes.
wanting to do it. And they finally pull the trigger and then they don't ever want to do it again because it's so much work and data transferring and
Yes.
then retraining. It's a lot of work, especially when we get into medical because the data is different with medical patients and you have HIPAA compliance and it's just a lot more involved when we come to
Yep.
medical patients versus 21 and up adult use. I wanted to talk a little bit about inventory reconciliation and cash alignment. Cash loss often shows up during inventory reconciliation. So, what strategies help align cash records with product movement? I find this a lot. Like when we're finding issues with cash, we're finding issues with inventory and how they're linked.
Such a great question. Oh my gosh. And also, like, you throw in like sales and promos and you're using your loyalty points to buy
Discounts,
something. Oh my gosh.
coupons.
I'm starting to sweat just thinking about it. Woo. Yes.
Uh,
Oh, such a great question. Where do I begin, Jenny? All right. So, yes, there's definitely a correlation between product reconciliation and cash reconciliation. And to my point earlier about if there's a variance, what is the process with that fine tooth comb that you have to go through to find that? And especially in a medical market, there's so many violations and fees and oh my gosh, like you don't want to get caught up in that mess. And then what are the operators doing to sweep it under the rug and cover it up and robbing a Peter to pay Paul? I use that expression just like hey, we're going to allot this for this particular bucket when it really came from over here. Like, how are they doing that and doing it within compliance? So there is definitely a correlation. And I think that is definitely an inquiry that each case when that occurs is different. Again, are we using promotional products? Is it a sale? Is it a giveaway? Again, in a medical market, you really can't do that. How is that occurring and what particular market? I think that the correlation is, again, are we using it for a promo? Are we using the discount code, a customer loyalty program? Is there a variance in the POS? Do we code it wrong? Did we label it wrong? Oftentimes we'll see that the label from your inventory management, your ERP system is incorrect. So that then in turn affects the POS and then of course the cash.
naming conventions are so important.
Important.
It's interesting because you have your vendors will name it something, right? And it gets dumped into your metric or your seed to sale tracking system. And then you're then bringing it over into your POS system from the cultivation or the manufacturer. And then you might have a naming convention that they put together that makes no sense whatsoever. And so then I feel like every operator should create naming conventions that make sense for all their processes and how they do things.
Yes, 100%. And if you are in Tampa, Florida, Tempe, Arizona, Tacoma, Washington, you should be speaking the same language, whether it's process related, procedure related, naming convention related, coding, like all of that should be the same. And that is, again, going back to our efficiency within our industry and streamlining things from a standards perspective. Let's not even forget about the lack of standards across the industry. If we had that standard in place, would rectify a lot of those challenges that we're
Yeah.
experiencing in that capacity, in that regard.
Yeah, I agree. And a lot of times too, people have to remember when you're in a cultivation, a lot of times the naming conventions have like the table number on it from the tables that they're growing on or the platforms or the
Hmm.
rows. And the naming convention in a cultivation facility, a lot of times they're using acronyms or abbreviations. And so it's just something to think about when you're bringing that over into the dispensary and to remember then that information then goes to your live menu. So you really do have to have that kind of figured out on the retail side. You have to clean up those naming conventions.
Girlfriend, you just spoke. Yes. And the flow through of that data from one to the other.
Yeah. How
Yeah.
important is daily reconciliation and spotting shrinkage before it escalates?
Not important at all. Nobody should do that. Kidding. Extremely important and
It
multiple times a
is.
day. Yes, absolutely. Especially when it comes to cash. Daily reconciliation, but shift reconciliation when we're talking about tills. So at the end of shift, those bartenders should be reconciling their drawer. They should be feeding that through a teller cash recycler or a cash counter, documenting it under dual control. And then that should be done also by with a manager. So I think multiple points of reconciliation throughout the day is important. I know that takes time, but we're going to provide some time savings in other places to where we're still showing an overall labor savings with deployment of those technologies and pieces of equipment.
So, for operators with multiple sites or beginning to expand into other states, how should their cash management strategies begin to evolve? Because it's going to be different now if I'm going to be in multiple states, or I'm going to have multiple facilities and I'm no longer that single state operator, that single location operator.
Great question. And I come across this oftentimes with my customers because they operate in multiple states. And that also is okay. To my point a moment ago, when I said whether you're in Tampa, Florida, Tempe, Arizona, Tacoma, Washington, you should be speaking the same language. That does also translate into your cash management strategies. They should be seamless across the board. One instance that I came across with an operator that was big in Massachusetts, they were entering the Florida market and they were concerned about making the investment in the equipment because we were not adult use yet in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And my recommendation is that we position ourselves for that growth when that is ready to occur. Obviously, it did not pass last year. And when they moved into Florida and they built out their 11 sites, they did not want to fully deploy the same technologies that they had in the adult use markets, which I understand. But that is my recommendation, is that you position yourself for that growth across all the markets, whether you are in an adult use market or a medical market, because there is always going to be cash in circulation, not maybe to the volume of cash, but we can build out for what that right fit is now and also have the ability to provide that additional capacity
Yeah.
when that switch comes. So I'm a big proponent of, for scalability, you want to keep it consistent all across the board. We want to make sure it's a right size, right fit across the board. And that being said, we might have to tailor a couple different solutions, but overall, your same processes in place, the same type of technology in place, with the ability to position yourself quick when that split gets switched, going from adult use, medical to adult use. So I think it's very important for that continuity and that consistency for training, for your executive offices, for your CFO, your controllers. It keeps everything consistent and it's the same, which provides efficiencies for your upper management team when they're looking through those reports, when they're even at the ground level, right? Whether you're 30,000 feet at corporate or in the weeds at the dispensary, keeping them consistent across the board is very important. And that is my position when we talk about across multiple state operators. I did a time and motion evaluation for one of the largest operators in our country. And it was profound to see how much money was going out the back door, whether it
Wow.
was from pilferage, theft, and they were so
My
focused on
gosh.
growth and expansion that they were overlooking what was happening at the ground level at their operations. I bet you they could have built out an entire market of dispensaries based on how much money was going out the back door. So it's almost like you can lead the horse to water and show them, but until that pain point, I always like to take a proactive approach and give them the information. When it's reactive, it's going to cost you more, right? It's already costing you more. It's going to cost you more to deploy that because how much have you already lost?
Yeah, I think being proactive actually costs
Mm,
less. I think what
mhm.
happens is people don't realize when you're not proactive, it actually costs more money to be reactive, because now you're solving a problem that probably might not have happened had you been proactive and spent the money to be proactive and have the systems in place.
This is my world, right? So I live in it. So I might have a biased lens, but I can appreciate, hey, they're working on their real estate. They're working on getting the product on the shelves. They're licensed. Like, I understand there's a lot more things ahead of management solutions that may, in their mind, take priority. So it's my job to show them why they need to give attention to this proactively versus reactively. And sometimes it's successful. Sometimes we circle back. Oftentimes they come back around and, hey, I should have done. And not that I would ever say I told you, but I understand that their perception is there's other priorities ahead of cash management. And again, it's my job to educate them on why it needs to have equal comparison or equal level of importance and initiatives to deploy that because of the cost savings on the front end.
Yeah, I think it's natural that people are just trying to problem solve. And a lot of times in these facilities, it's a lot of putting out fires and
Mhm.
constant problem solving and management. There's just a lot of compliance pressure. At the end of the day, a lot of times they're not auditing themselves, or they're not hiring someone to come and do these audits. And in the early days, people used to be very proactive with audits. And now I find it's more reactive, that I'm getting calls saying, "Hey, we have this thing going on. We have this issue. We kind of messed up. Can you help us? Or we're in the middle of an investigation." And that's what I find in the more mature markets. I say in the new emerging markets where you have brand new people who have never done this before, a lot more proactive out of the gate. And so this whole market is dictated by what state you're in, what phase somebody's in, Have they operated in another state versus have they never done this before? And it really dictates a lot of the choices, and money is so woven into every single choice that somebody makes in the industry. But I'm here to remind people compliance is woven into every single choice that you
Mhm.
make in the cannabis industry, and that every choice that you make affects compliance somehow, even though you're making that decision from a financial perspective and how you're going to run your business, or those choices, whether you're going to put compliance on the chopping block. And I see this all the time where they're like, we're going to get rid of our safety manager. We're not going to have an in-house compliance person anymore. We don't need that person going around and doing those audits anymore. And because depending on what state they're in, they're going lean, they're trying to cut back costs. And
Yep.
it can really start to create these risks in the business. And we're already high risk. We're high risk. We're like liquor stores, pawn shops, guns,
Yeah, all of it.
gaming. It's a high risk industry. I think it will always be a high risk industry. I don't think that's going to change.
I agree. I agree.
So where do you see the future of cannabis cash management heading, and how operators can prepare?
I alluded to regulation and rescheduling. And so there'll be an impact to cash, right? Cash will always be in circulation. Cash will always be a form of tender that we're going to accept at dispensaries. Um, And so I think that in the next 3 to 5 years, being prepared for rescheduling, if not sooner, will allow for more digital transactions, digital options, legal digital
Yeah.
options. But operators need to be prepared for what that looks like with the entirety of the industry, maybe as an adult use market, right? With the amounts of cash will also increase, right? You got to think of like tourist markets like Colorado, California, Florida, New York. You made this point earlier when we were preparing for the call. There's still signs on dispensaries in New York that say cash only,
Yes.
right? So it's why are they still cash only? I think that when tourists travel, oftentimes they're still traveling with a bunch of cash. Do they travel with traveler's checks anymore? Is that still a thing? No, I'm kidding. I don't think so.
Traveler's checks,
But
that's
traveler's
just
checks,
very
yeah.
1990s.
Yes, you're welcome for that deja vu moment brought to you by the cannabis cash queen. But yeah,
Yes.
so when people are traveling for vacation, there's going to be more cash in circulation, cash used as a tender. So you got to look at those markets, especially in those tourist driven industries. I'm working with the US Virgin Islands right now, right? So they're relying heavily on their program on the adult use side to be very tourist centric, tourist heavy, right? And so what does that look like from a banking cash management perspective? So there's a whole layer of complexities there that we can get into another time. But having operators prepare for the abundant use of cash, the proper preparation for it, and deploying the proper technology will best position them for when rescheduling occurs or just as our industry continues to flourish.
That's really helpful. I guess in wrapping up, are there any other best practices or anything that you want to leave listeners with that will be very helpful when it comes to cash management?
Yes, call me and let's have a conversation. I would love to chat with any operators that think that they have a good program, but would love to have an evaluation done where we can streamline processes. Again, I affectionately refer to it as the cannabis cash ecosystem. So we want to make sure that all of those touch points are seamless and we can identify any gaps, especially if you're a new operator. That blank canvas is where I love to operate. I love to help build and create this beautiful process that is fresh from the start and helps you save money in the long run. I love working with existing operators, but there's a few more webs to untangle,
Yeah,
right? So call me for an evaluation. I would love to work with you and chat with you. I love being on site, even if it's a virtual call. It's definitely something that I love to talk about. Hopefully the listeners hear my passion and my excitement around it. It's not too many people get geeked out around like cash management, but
I geek out on compliance,
it's,
and it's
it's
not for
sexy,
everyone.
right? It's sexy.
It's I'm a systems person. Michael Jordan is Michael Jordan. I couldn't try to go on the basketball court and be Michael Jordan. I can only be Jenny Germano, and I see things a really specific way, and I see the way that systems work, and not everybody can see the intricacies of systems. That's just
Mhm.
my skill set. That's my Michael Jordan moment.
That I'm gonna have to think of. That is a wonderful analogy, and it makes sense. And number 23.
We all have a Michael Jordan in us. I believe every human on the planet has some kind of gift or skill set. Whether or
Mhm.
not they're tapped into it or not, that's like up to them, and whether obviously if they've figured it out or
Yeah.
express themselves in that way. I think for you, it's obviously cash management because you've been doing this your whole life and the ins and outs. I understand cash management because I've
You,
run
we're in
dispensaries,
it.
but I don't
Yeah.
have the deep relationship with it that you have.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting. It was never my goal to this was the path, right? We don't really it's not my plan, right? And I never want to leave this earth knowing that I didn't tap into the skill sets that I was given. So I'm so grateful for that. And I'm so grateful to make a difference and to help an untapped area that is a very much a challenge for operators. And Jenny, I am retail agnostic, right? I love the cannabis industry for personal reasons, as we all have a personal story around it. But obviously, it is my skill set based on my experience that has led me to offer this solution to the industry. And I do work with your average convenience store or your gaming facility or a restaurant. So retail agnostic, I would love to just see if how I could be of service. And my superpower, Jenny, is connecting people. So if there is something that a customer needs, and it may not be with me, but I can make that connection, happy to do. If only I could monetize that gift of connecting people, but it was a God-given gift, and I'm happy to use that when appropriate. What I would say is 833-343-CASH is my number. So find me there or my website, cannabiscashconsultants.com. Email me at jen@cannabiscashconsultants, 1N, LinkedIn. So I would love to get connected with your listeners. If there's any way that I can help with anything cash related, banking, logistics, on-site management, I'm here to help. And I just so appreciate the opportunity to bring my experience of what I do to your show and to your audience.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I'll make sure I'll have that information posted as well with the episode in case people did not get to write that down. And I'll have the links and stuff connected so they can find you. So thank you again. I appreciate you joining me today and being a guest on my podcast. I really think this is going to be really helpful for listeners.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity and I can't wait. See you again. I can't wait to see you
We
again.
do. We need to get together here soon. So, for anyone who wants to know where to stream this podcast, it's going to be available on Apple, Spotify, and iHeartRadio and Pandora Radio. And then also check out my YouTube channel at Under the Microscope with Jenny. And that way, if you enjoy watching videos, that's the place to be. And go to my channel and subscribe. That would help me out. Thanks again to Jen Makris for coming on here today. We really appreciate you and thank you again.
Thank you.